This discussion is about character strength 5, which is moderation. Under moderation, there is modesty, prudence, and self-control. First, we need background information in temperance. So temperance, according to the Cambridge English Dictionary, is the control of your own behavior. Also, in modern uses, temperance is known as and defined as moderation. This means that temperance and moderation are connected and are similar. Third, with that, there also exists the strengths of temperance. These strengths of temperance are positive traits that protect us from excess or from doing too much of something that may not be good for us. So here are some examples. What protects us from arrogance is humility and modesty. What protects us from short-term pleasure with long-term costs is prudence. And what protects us from destabilizing emotional extremes of all sorts is self-regulation. More of these will be discussed in the following slides. Also, it is important to take note that these strengths of temperance do not put our activities to a full stop. Instead, it tempers them. These strengths of temperance can only neutralize and counterbalance our actions. They cannot put our actions to a halt. So there's a criteria for a strength of character. The characteristics must go through the criteria and pass most of them to be considered a character strength. So there are 10 of them. The first is fulfilling. Each characteristic must be capable of giving an individual the inner satisfaction. Next is, it must be morally valued, meaning each of them must be something deemed good and acceptable by majority. Next is, it must not diminish others. The characteristic must not be oppressive by nature. Fourth is non-felicitous opposite. Non-felicitous opposite means that for every characteristic, they must have an undesirable counterpart, or in easier terms, a bad opposite. Next is, it must be trait-like, or like a trait among individuals. Sixth is distinctiveness, or simply to say, it should be identifiable from the rest. Seventh, it must have paragons. So paragons are must-have examples or models of excellence. Next is prodigies. This means that every characteristic must be observable among the younger generations. Ninth is selective absence. Selective absence means that there are some individuals that just do not have these characteristics. It's simply absent in them. It's not innate in them. It's not developed in them. Lastly, institutions and rituals. Institutions and rituals are the things done to cultivate, improve, and strengthen these characteristics.
Hi, my name is Joyce Marie Gepiga, and I will talk about humility and modesty. Humility, among all other virtues, are the hardest to achieve because, well, nothing dies harder than the desire to think well of oneself, right? So, humility and modesty have always been linked together, but they are distinct from each other. Humility is more internal, that it refers to a person's own sense that he or she are not the center of the universe. But maybe oneself can claim or have a sense that he or she is a part of the universe, but not literally the center. He is just a valuable part of the universe. While modesty, it's more external. It is generally the absence of something physical found in the self. It is a self-conscious style of drawing attention to the self. It refers to how one dresses, the car one drives, the house one wants or owns. Therefore, presumed modesty can exist without true humility, and true humility necessarily leads to modesty. So there are important factors that are keys that we have to consider or we have to remember. To be humble and modest does not entail self-derogation or self-humiliation. Humility and modest, these traits does not mark a person as a loser or a depressive person. These traits lead to a presentation of the self in an accurate way, nothing more, nothing less, including its strengths and limitations. The humble or modest person is necessarily honest and authentic, but the honest or authentic person may or not be humble, modest. Next, consensual definitions. According to Tangney, he identified a number of humility's key features: an accurate, not underestimated or overestimated sense of one's ability and achievement, the ability to acknowledge one's mistake, imperfection, gaps in knowledge, and limitations. It is simply acknowledging that you are not perfect and that you have gaps, and that you are open to new ideas, contradictory information, and advice as long as it has strong support or reference. Keeping one's ability and accomplishments in perspective. Next is relatively low focus on the self or the ability to forget the self. Being humble is not putting the self in the center or not focusing the self but forgetting the self. Lastly, it is the appreciation of the value of things as well as many different ways that people and things can contribute to our world. These are humility's key features, while modesty refers primarily to the moderate estimation of one's merit or achievements. So moderate estimation of one's merit or achievements. So that's modesty. Nothing more, nothing less. What you have, you will moderately estimate everything else, and it extends over other issues relating to dress and social behavior. So modesty, it's more on the external, that is why social behavior and the propriety in dressing. While humility's key feature, these are, as we all know, humility is more internal, it's accurate evaluation. Next is on humility, which we regard a private stance towards the evaluation of the self, while we regard modesty as more socially oriented virtue. That is why I said it is modesty is more on the social construct, while a person would behave as much as the environment will demand it to be. So humility has negative associations. For example, a humble person may look at the ground or as weak or passive and lacking of self-respect and confidence. However, humility does not imply any negative views of the self. In fact, humble individuals can have positive opinions of themselves if they base it on their intrinsic values, good qualities, a sense of compassion towards the self, their connections with other people. Next, so what really is the essence of humility? Being humble is viewing the self in optimal continuum, including the strengths and limitations and everything in between. Humble people are not interested in dominating other people because they are humble and they respect everyone. If one is better than them, they accept it, they respect it, they are humble, they know and they are aware of their limitations and their strengths, what they are good at and what they are not. Perspective and humility implies a willingness to see the self accurately, because the accuracy of a person's appraisal could serve as a useful marker for humility. So a useful marker for humility is the accuracy of the person's evaluation. Next, theorists argue that the assumption about transcendence is something religious. It's something religious that cannot be understood from a secular perspective or those that are not religious. So it is believed a reality that is so fundamental about humility. But taking into account the less extreme view and propose that transcendent beliefs are not essentially components of humility, taking account when people are humble but not religious. Research suggests that humility takes the form of lowering rather than lifting one's evaluation of the self. Similarly, attempts at modesty should frequently involve resisting the temptation to boast rather than self-deprecate. So modesty is only about the stopping yourself or resisting yourself from boasting whatever you have externally, and humility is taking into account of lowering one's evaluation of the self enough. So there are a lot of measures that were conducted to measure humility and modesty, but there is no direct way to increase these traits of a person. So attempts to assess modesty have been straightforward, while attempts to measure humility have been difficult and indirect. Humility might be better construed as the absence of narcissism, or those people who see themselves highly, self-enhancement, or defensiveness. So one of the measures of humility is self-report questionnaires, but it has a problem because it's self-report questionnaires. It could be biased by the participants. For example, I will ask how humble you are, and a person with confidence would rate him or herself with 10, but a humble person would probably rate him or herself 5. There are scenario methods, proxy measures for low humility like narcissism, entitlement, self-enhancement, or defensiveness. Like narcissism, entitlement, and self-enhancing or defensiveness will be measured, and physiological responses to ego threat. The person will be put in a situation where his or her ego will be threatened, and his physiological responses will be measured. Think aloud paradigms, comparing evaluation to self-evaluation by others, and comparing private versus public self-evaluation. And with these last two, it was found out that people would prefer honest feedback, accurate feedback, no matter if it's negative feedback. Next, development factors such as parental modeling of humility. Educational approaches and other institutions can be crucial for a child to learn that positive and negative feedback are worth considering and to promote secure attachment. Secure attachment, it provides a sense of security, and with this sense of security, it serves as a buffer for a child to not feel sad or angry about negative feedback. And these factors surrounding the child in the early stage of life, such as parental, like educational approaches, it can be a crucial factor for a child to learn that positive and negative feedback are worth self-enhancement or to the betterment of the self, enabling an inhibiting factor. Identity development is necessary for the presence of humility and modesty. And according to Cooper and his colleagues, it showed that connectedness in family relation facilitates identity information. And Hauser and colleagues found that enabling behaviors such as explaining, giving empathy, and accepting promote identity more than constraining behaviors. It only goes to show that identity development, which is necessary for the presence of humility and modesty, factors such as or enabling behaviors such as explaining, giving empathy, and family relations facilitate identity formation. And it is more than constraining behaviors such as judging or evaluating. These factors and other disciplinary and family interaction styles only indirectly foster the development of modesty and humility. So if the child is surrounded by all these factors, it will indirectly foster the development of modesty and humility. Next, gender and cross-national. According to research, there is no gender differences between humility and modesty and humility are more valued in a collectivist culture such as in Japan and here in the Philippines than those in the individualism such as the American culture. And cross-cultural aspects, personal deficits will be addressed only if individuals are open and willing to see that they exist. If one is willing to self-criticize in a moderate manner, one will be able to move towards self-improvement. So self-criticism should be done in a moderate manner, not in less or not in more, not more or less. So Only then issues will be addressed if it is openly brought about. Next, deliberate intervention. Self-enhancement is a controllable bias rather than a cognitive illusions. Distortions can be reduced through a simple respect for a change in perspective, and through this, there is some hope that people can learn to override the tendencies to self-enhance. In the service of accuracy, people do seem willing to accept some negative feedback about others and themselves, though in the service of accuracy, positive and negative feedback should be taken into account. For accuracy purposes, religiousness fosters humility through self-transcendence. Transcendence is something religious that is in connection with higher being and nature, and it's something that includes meditation or others. So for religions to promote humility, religion should encourage people that they are valuable and safe, and not only as part of the universe. Next, researches and programs such as character development offer some hope for humility and modesty cultivation, but no direct formal intervention specifically designed to increase this trend. So there are programs, there are development, there are researches to cultivate humility and modesty to every person, but there is no direct formal intervention specifically designed to increase these trends unless they lead to a lifestyle. And leading to a lifestyle change, a person may be reduced from self-focus or gain a new perspective on the self without feeling that the self has been obliterated or damaged. It was believed that people will be more willing and able to cultivate humility if they have a sense of security. And remember, the sense of security buffers all the negative feedbacks and information and not entirely on self-evaluation. Therefore, any technique, resources, or relationship that would make a person feel safe, secure, aside from self-evaluation, would facilitate.
Now, we will be discussing prudence. So prudence is the act of cautiousness or being careful. Now, when you call someone prude, it often isn't taken as a praise. Most often than not, it is only perceived as a remark towards someone. Prudes or prudent people are timid, uptight, overly cautious, and boring. When a person is prudent, they tend to pay attention to more detail and they're more analytical because they want to make every decision in the best way they can. However, prudence is a form of practical reasoning and self-management that helps one to achieve long-term goals effectively by considering carefully along the way the consequences of actions taken and not taken. So when one has prudence, or when one is prude, they are able to reason and manage themselves in a way that they can get the desired outcomes for their long-term goals. They do not sacrifice their long-term goals for their short-term enjoyment. They will keep in mind the things that will give them the most satisfaction, even if it takes a longer time. The prudent person makes smart choices as opposed to no choices at all. Prudence is a strength of character when it leads us to do things in a judicious way. This means that prudence becomes a strength of character when we do things with a sound judgment, when we know exactly what we're doing, and when we know its consequences. So now we're going to talk about the criteria for character strength in prudence. First, fulfilling. Prudence is fulfilling but not necessarily fun. Yes, this is true because when you are prude, you take everything into consideration, and that could mean that you'll miss out on some temporary fun things. Next is, it guides us to refrain actions that may deal us regret, guilt, or shame. Next, prudence helps us to do actions that direct us to achieving our long-term intended consequences. Because of prudence, we're able to see the things in the long run. We get to have a clear vision of what we truly want by doing something about it in the present. Next is, prudence is morally valued. Prudence is a trait that we want to be instilled and cultivated in children. This is very evident, especially in our culture. Next, if children can be taught to think before acting, to look before leaping, to make smart choices, and to ask why as well as why not, then they will become prudent adolescents and prudent adults, worthy of praise for forethought and practical intelligence. Most parents, when they raise their children, they instill analytical skills, and these analytical skills, most often than not, lead to prudence. That's why there are children who grow up to be trusted by the adults. Next is, does not diminish others. Prudence in oneself does not diminish others, but it may slow people down because analyzing what's best could take time. So there's a fable by Aesop where winter was coming and the ants thought of preparing stocks of food for the inevitable winter, while the grasshopper just played and did not prepare. Then when winter came, the ants were well supplied because they worked for it. They saw it coming even before, while the grasshopper went hungry. The ants were prudent while the grasshopper was carefree, and because of the ants' prudence, they were rewarded with food, a benefit that they did to themselves, while the grasshopper was suffering because of something that he did not do. There's a right time for work and a right time for playing around. Next is non-felicitous opposite. Prudence undesirable counterparts are not spontaneity or zest, but recklessness, foolishness, thoughtlessness, and irresponsibility. The prudent person will seek for experiences that provide interesting sensations without danger. Prudent people it doesn't make them less of a person or boring just because they don't want the adrenaline or the dangers that other adventurous people would refer to as the only thing as fun. Prudent people will still seek those sensations, but they try to do it in the way where there's least danger. The prudent person knows the difference between thrill-seeking and the senseless courting of disaster. Next is trait-like. Prudence is trait-like. It comes in different forms for every person who has it. Prudence is approximated by the notion of consciousness and its absence by impulsivity and sensation-seeking. Sixth is distinctiveness. Prudence is distinct from other character strengths. However, it may be possible to render prudence as a blend of other strengths like open-mindedness and self-regulation. So as we go deeper into prudence, we'll find out that there are several researches that had results that were not very helpful to strengthening prudence in the scientific field. Thus, distinctiveness in the criteria is prudence's weakest link. Number 7 are paragons. Paragons of prudence exist in two levels. So the mundane level and the heroic level. So the mundane level are these are the simple ways such as wearing a seatbelt, heeding storm warnings, simple preparations that can benefit us. Second is the heroic level. These are higher ways of manifesting prudence, like how firefighters analyze situations before entering a burning building. Also, it is worth noting that firefighters need to be cautious and prudent. They wouldn't go into a burning building unless a retreat is possible. They need to be prudent as they take large risks because what's in line here are their lives. Truly brave people choose their moments carefully, and their thoughtfulness is a sign of prudence. The eighth are prodigies. Prodigies of prudence cannot exist until children have the cognitive capacity to engage in counterfactual thinking that weighs pros and cons of hypothetical courses of action. So, prodigies in prudence develop as the younger generations grow up. It's instilled by them, their parents, as we talked about in the second criteria, which is morally valued, where most parents would instill prudence in their children as they grow up. This means that prodigies in prudence can be found among adolescents. The prudent adolescents are most often than not those who gain the trust of the adults because of their prudence. The ninth is selective absence. As much as there are a lot of people who are prude, there will always be people who are imprudent, and they can be found in all walks of life. Apparently, most imprudent people are visible in emergency rooms of hospitals where they are brought for what we so-called bizarre accidents. There are people who fall into accidents that are unimaginable just because they weren't thinking about it. They were just doing things out of the straight fact that they wanted to do it. They didn't think about the consequences. They didn't consider anything else. In 2002, there were multiple events highlighted that led to death because of their own imprudent actions. So, the Darwin Awards are an awarding ceremony where people who died are given this award for having speculatively helped in the evolution of people. So there were events like dying because of a knife unintendedly, suffocating unintendedly because of olive oil, and more events like those which are very bizarre. The prudent person would ask, what were they thinking when they see such imprudent events? Lastly, institutions and rituals. Institutions and rituals certainly attempt to cultivate and encourage prudence. Examples of these are parents worrying for their children and teaching why they are worried. Many parents become wary of situations for their children, and that alone is a sign of prudence. Then they tell their children why they are worried, they explain to them, and then the children in turn pick up something about prudence, an idea about prudence, and this is already a part of the institutions and rituals. It helps them develop prudence. Another example is the media releasing information on what to avoid and what not to avoid. This also cultivates prudence. More useful strategies for cultivating prudence are those that provide instruction in prudent action and practical reasoning that marks prudence, such as asking, what are the pros and cons if I do this? The habit of asking, what can you get and what can you lose if you do a certain action is already a sign of prudence, and it's already something that you do to cultivate and encourage prudence. We now move on to the measures of prudence. Most of the measures of prudence that have been developed derive from the trait psychological approach and are therefore primarily measures of the five-factor model's conscientiousness factor. So here are some examples on the measures of prudence. First is the Neo-PIR conscientiousness subscale. It is a 240-item questionnaire. This measures facets of conscientiousness, and this applies strong psychometrics. The second measure is Neo-FFI conscientiousness subscale. It is a 60-item in total questionnaire. The third one is a trait descriptions conscientiousness subscale. It is a 100-item in total questionnaire and a 50-item instrument with bipolar adjective pairs also available. The next one is the Big Five inventory, or the BFI conscientiousness subscale. It is a 44-item in total questionnaire. Lastly, and the most effective, as they say, is the Hogan Personality Inventory, or HPI conscientiousness subscale. It is a 310 items in total questionnaire, and it measures components of conscientiousness. Internal consistency is weaker than Neo-PIR. Besides the given measures of prudence, there are also self-report measures that could measure prudence. However, all these measures of prudence are likely questionable because their measure of prudence is very closely related to other characteristics that may alter the results. As of the present time, there is no exact scientific measure of prudence yet. All are simply theories and under study, and none of them have been proven so far. We now move on to correlates and consequences. As is commonly known, the case in the study of individual differences, it is difficult to assess whether variables found to covary with measures of prudence are simply correlates of the construct or whether they are instead influenced by it. So a few studies have investigated associations between prudence or conscientiousness or psychopathology. John, Casfi, and colleagues from 1994 found that more conscientious adolescent boys had lower levels of psychopathology, so conscientiousness is highly related to prudence, and they found out that when adolescent boys are more conscientious, they had lower chances and lesser chances to be psychopaths when they grow up. Some research has addressed the links between prudence-related characteristics and physical well-being. Conscientiousness measured in middle childhood and measured in part by a rating of prudence has been found to predict longer life. In short, prudence seems to be associated with several positively valued personality dispositions, psychological and physical well-being, the absence of certain forms of psychopathology and antisocial conduct, and superior attainment at work and school. To simplify it, prudence is related to a lot of positive characteristics. It influences your psychological and physical well-being as well. Then, with prudence, there's an absence of certain forms of antisocial behaviors and lower chances of being psychopaths. Also, prudence more often suggests that you can do better at work and school. We now move on to the development of prudence through the years. So, very little research has been done about prudence through the years. By implication, prudence may fundamentally involve the capacity or propensity to imaginatively identify with or project oneself into a future self. The different studies done about prudence also suggest an interesting link between prudence and a moral virtue, and raises the possibility that prudence and altruism might be associated in adulthood. So as I've said before, the studies on prudence did not necessarily provide scientific evidences for it to further develop in the scientific field. However, the best things that research on prudence has done were the findings on adolescents, such as the ones that I have mentioned a while ago. Now moving on to the enabling and inhibiting factors. Little, if any, research has been conducted on factors that develop or interfere with prudence. Thus, we are unlikely to locate developmental influences on prudence that are shared within families, such as parenting style, social class, religious background, and so on. Prudence would, in theory, be thwarted in people who live or have grown up under chaotic and unpredictable conditions in which the future seems so uncertain and remote that long-term planning is pointless. So, for example, there are people who live in situations where it's always messy. The pressure is always there. It's heavy. When people live under heavy situations, prudence may not exist within them because it becomes pointless. They don't have the time to plan. They don't have the time to analyze because the life they're living pushes them to directly move and remove the time for them to analyze. Thus, prudence could not be in them. It could inhibit their prudence. Next, it should be thwarted in circumstances where people do not enjoy sufficient autonomy and personal control to define a personal domain of goals and ends to be striven for. Also, when a person does not have control over their life, they might lose the goals. They might lose sight of the goals that they originally wanted. So when a person does not have goals, it's like they have nothing to live for. So what use is prudence when you see nothing for yourself in the future? We now move on to gender, cross-national, and cross-cultural aspects. So there is no systematic research on the relationship between prudence and gender. So the lack of research on prudence might be the very reason why we cannot identify if there is a relationship or a correlation between prudence and gender. Next is there is likely no substantial and vivid gender differences for prudence. So this might mean that there is no mean difference between men and women when it comes to prudence. Third is cross-cultural generality to prudence is coherent to individual differences. So the different cultures in the world could also be a reason that one has prudence or not, meaning the different cultures also play a role in the development of prudence. Next, despite not having substantial differences, there are gender connotations related to prudence. For example, the inhibitory and restraint aspects of prudence are stereotypically referred to as feminine, while the more agentic aspects of prudence like achievement, motivation are connotated to be masculine. Also, as time went by, prudence has been used as a female name. Next are deliberate interventions. Certain forms of cognitive psychotherapy, for instance, focus on improving practical reasoning skills to strengthen emotional well-being and correct cognitive distortions and inflexibilities that deflect decision-making towards myopic and impulsive choices. Therefore, little is known scientifically about prudence since the studies conducted for it reaped results that showed little to no connection at all. In the present day, more observations and studies are conducted in hopes of finally finding out more about prudence.
So I'm back and I will talk about self-regulation. Regulation, it refers to how a person exerts control over his or her responses, thoughts, emotions, impulses, performance, and other behavior, so as to pursue goals and to live up to the standards of society, like ideals, norms, moral judgments, performance targets, and the expectations of other people. Self-regulation, like humility and modesty, have been linked to self-control and self-discipline. However, self-control is used narrowly to refer specifically to control one's impulses or responses so as to behave in a moral fashion. So, oneself should control one's impulses or responses, like thoughts, emotions, impulses, behaviors. And while self-discipline, in a narrower sense, it refers to making oneself do things that one does not want to do and resisting temptation. So in self-discipline, you are resisting temptation. So do you see the difference between the three? Next, theoretical, the term self-regulation was used by Bandura, which we know of his behaviorist theory, as he proposed that people administer rewards and punishment to themselves. That is why people exert control over their own behaviors. The study of delay of gratification by Michel and his colleagues lies the most influential roots of contemporary research. Delayed gratification is resisting the temptation to take the small rewards to stop initial responses in order to secure a larger and optimal benefit. So example, I am studying and I am very busy, and my parents would tell me that, oh, if you study hard, we'll give you something like this and something like that after the semester. So I will resist myself. I will not fall into temptation and wait until the sem finishes and claim my rewards. That is delayed gratification. And through this delayed gratification, I will be able to take control, to self-regulate myself and take responsible of the impulses that I have. Cybernetic theory, it states that focusing attention on the self was more than a mere source of discomfort, but it was a crucial means by which the self appraised its current relation to the standard. It has that theory has feedback loops phase in the acronym of TOTE: test, operate, test, and exit. The self compares itself to the relevant standard, and if the current status of the self according to the standard fails, it begins its operation, where the self alters itself to bring itself in line with the standards. And further test, after that operation, further tests will be conducted periodically until the standard is finally met and the loop is exited. Research suggests that altering the self is a form of strength, and for it requires mental and psychological control. By Wagner and his colleagues proposed that when a person tries to suppress an unwanted thought, a psychological system is established that serves two purposes. One component, the monitoring processes, automatically searches the environment for indications of the unwanted thought. The other component is the operating processes. It is activated when the monitoring system finds a sign of the unwanted thought. The operating system process uses controlled responses to override the responses that follow from the detection of the unwanted thought. For example, in the monitoring processes, if one doesn't, if one is craving for cookies but he or she is on a diet, in monitoring processes, it automatically searches the environment for indication of that unwanted thought or of that suppressed thought. And operating processes is activated when the monitoring system finds a sign of the unwanted thought, and he or she will divert his or So two important explanations regarding the effectiveness of thought suspension or thought suppression. First, resurgence. Resurgence of the unwanted thought after the thought restrictions have been lifted. So the more you suppress your unwanted thought, once it is lifted, once the restriction is lifted, it will it will reappear or reoccur again. Second, the automaticity of the monitoring function. Automatic monitoring system will continue to alert the person of the signs of the unwanted thoughts. So, of those unwanted thoughts, you will be automatically be alerted of the signs of those unwanted thoughts. For example, the cookie. 4 basic antecedent strategies of self-control. So these strategies, antecedent strategies, are aimed at managing or preventing emotional states. So first is situation selection. So this refers to selecting aspects of the environment like people or setting. Next is situation modification. Actions aimed at altering the environment to modify emotional responses. Like one will alter people or the setting to not have any emotional responses or to prevent emotional state or the change in emotional state. Next is attentional deployment. Attention and effort are directed at aspects of environment that help achieve desired emotional states. Cognitive change in reinterpreting the situation to modify its emotional effects. So this cognitive change, one will reinterpret the situation in order to prevent changes in emotional states. Next, another is response-focused strategy. So this is used following the emotion-invoking episode. So there is only one strategy, and that is response modulation. It involves actively changing an existent emotional response. In the total sense, researches have been conducted to know and infer how people regulate their behavior, and either successfully or not in a spheres. Like everything that consists of human being. Next, measures of self-regulation. The 2 self-control scales are commonly used by the researchers, and this is the self-control questionnaires and the self-control scales and low self scales in connection with criminals and antisocial behaviors. Grasmack et al. Has been used. So Grasmack and et al. This is used for self-control behaviors related to criminality. Personality and social psychologists had adopted Tange scale as a measure to assess self-control of broad range of social behavior. So self-control scale. So there are a lot of measures to measure self-control. Failure of self-regulation is essential to nearly all personal and social problems such as drug addiction, unwanted pregnancy, personal deaths, and just to name a few. So if a person fails to regulate itself, all problems such as drug addiction is essentially because the person is out of control. So self-control predicts the presence of positive outcomes. Michel and colleagues have demonstrated that self-control benefits in their theory of delayed gratification, where it was found that children who have been successful in delayed gratification at the age 4 will both academically and socially be successful as rated by teachers and peers in young adulthood or a decade after. People with healthy self-control make better relationship partners and get along with other people generally and exhibit better accommodation in a sense of adjusting their behavior to get along with correlates and consequences. Self-control predicts the absence of negative outcomes. High self-control is associated with the absence of variety of impulses control problems. For example, people with good self-control are less likely to abuse drugs or alcohol. So if you have control over yourself, you will be less likely to be abusing drugs or alcohols. So these are the absence of negative outcomes because you're in control of a negative. So is it possible that, or is there a downside of self-regulation? So by far there is no many undesirable consequences of high self-control. Research were administered to see if excessive self-control may have negative consequences, but there are no patterns found. So the development, self-control appears to show substantial consistency across the development as indicated with the delay of gratification of self-control at the age of 4 that predicts positive and successful outcomes, and it remains stable throughout the lifetime. Gottfredson cited that there is a higher rate of criminality among children of single parent due to lack of supervision that leads to delinquency and criminal behavior. So children at a young age should have a strong relationship with its parents to have a stable outcome, stable behavior throughout the lifetime. It is important also, however, it should be noted that there is some evidence that peer influence plays a larger role than the parental supervision or attachment in determining delinquency. That is why the debate about nature and nurture has been so complicated by the interplay of the two opposing forces, such as the parent side and the peer pressure or the peer To improve self-control, Moravin in 1999 hypothesized that it would become stronger from regular exercise, such as improving posture for 2 weeks. So according to Moravin, self-control will be improved through regular exercise, and to achieve better self-control, behaviors of people should be monitored where self-awareness is crucial. So there should be self-awareness. There should be self-awareness in monitoring the behavior of a person through recording, keeping a record, or securing the cooperation of other people to actively remind them of his or her goal. So enabling and inhibiting factors. To live a balanced, well-regulated life, it might be necessary to recognize that the capacity for controlling oneself depends on a limited resource that needs to be managed effectively and conserved for the most pressing or important demands. Those who live only in the present moment are unlikely to exhibit good self-control. However, future-mindedness will facilitate self-regulation. An example of this is spending your money. If you are a person who is mindful of the future, you will facilitate self-regulation and it will control your finances. But if you're a person who live in the moment, you're unlikely to exhibit good self-control and just spend all of it like it's your last day. The environment can teach people whether self-regulation and resistant temptation are gender and cross-national and cross-cultural aspects. Trait measures of self-control yield no gender references. So this, like the humility and modesty, there is no gender differences. Males are more aggressive and exhibit sexual misbehavior than females. Sexual misbehavior, meaning males do not have that self-control like in females. Since self-control is learned, culture plays a crucial role for culture sets appropriate rules about the behavior, people's behavior. So in culture, culture is fluid. People would take into account or bring into their life what the society, what people around them are teaching them, and that's culture. And it is also crucial for self-control to be learned. Thus, cultural change brought about a sudden shift in patterns of how people regulated their behavior. So if there is a sudden change in patterns of how people regulated their behavior, so that is because of change. Therefore, Self-regulation and self-control are unique human strengths. Every organism can respond to changing environment, but only humans intentionally and willfully modify, alter, or change their responses. And I am hoping that after this, we all have self-control and regulate ourselves, as this is human strengths, and according to studies, this brings good outcomes in future life, successful and good. You will be in a good relationship. So that's all, and thank you.